Sandra Okafor did not look at him when she said it. She was standing at the head of the conference table, with a legal pad open in front of her and a red pen uncapped in her right hand, and she said it to the room rather than to the man she was dismissing. She said there had been a review. She said the terms of the consulting arrangement no longer aligned with the direction of the company. She said, and this was the part that the man at the far end of the table, the one who had said nothing since she began, would remember for a long time afterward, that Vantara Dynamics required professionals at a certain level of institutional credentialing, and that the engagement, effective immediately, was concluded. Nathan Reeves was sitting with both hands flat on the table. He had a canvas work bag at his feet and a green thermos in front of him that was still warm. He wore a gray shirt with a small oil stain near the second button that he had tried to wash out the night before. He was the only person in the room not wearing a jacket. He looked at Sandra Okafor for a long moment. Then he looked at the man sitting 2 seats to her left. Marcus Halliday, the CF, was studying his phone with the careful focus of someone who had decided in advance how much presence to give the room. Nathan said one thing before he stood. He said, "The secondary load frame on the prototype is running a fatigue signature I have not cleared yet. I need 3 more days before anyone stress tests that assembly." She appreciated his concern and that the engineering team would take it from here. He picked up the canvas bag. He did not take the thermos. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood with his back to the conference room while the doors opened. The man watching all of this from the doorway of the adjacent office was a senior structural analyst named Paul Gentry. He had worked at Vantara Dynamics for 11 years. He had seen consultants come and go in slow institutional cycles. He had never seen one who walked out of a room the way Nathan Reeves walked out of that room, with his shoulders level and his pace unhurried, like a man who had set something down precisely where it needed to be set and was moving on. Paul watched the elevator doors close. He stood in the doorway for a full minute before he was able to return to his desk. The morning had started, as most of Nathan Reeves's mornings started, at 20 minutes before 6. He was at the kitchen counter threading a small elastic band through the zipper pull of Iris's school bag, a repair he had made 4 times in as many months. When she appeared in the doorway in her socks and pajamas, her hair pressed flat on the left side from sleep. She had Spool tucked under her arm. Spool was a small cloth rabbit, gray and softened from years of handling, with one ear missing entirely, and the remaining ear restitched at the base with yellow thread, thick and slightly uneven, the work of a woman who had been better at precision than at sewing. The yellow thread was the only yellow thing in the rabbit's worn body. Iris's mother had chosen it. She had been particular about yellow. Iris looked at him for a moment, taking in the canvas bag on the floor beside the door and the green thermos on the counter. "Are you going to the big building today?" she said. "Just for the morning," Nathan said. "I'll be at the shop by 2. She considered this. She set Spool down on the counter near the coffee machine, which was the place Spool went when Iris needed both hands. "Will you call me before lunch? If you're in class, I'll leave a message. Mrs. Dalton lets me check messages at noon. Then I'll call before noon," he said. She picked Spool back up, tucked him under her arm, and returned to the cereal she had poured herself and left on the table. He checked the elastic band, tested the zipper twice, set the bag by the door, and poured his coffee into the thermos. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the front yard, where the maple tree was just beginning to soften its edges toward the warm part of the year. He had planted it the spring after the accident. He did not think about that consciously anymore. He simply looked at it each morning the way a person looks at something they know is doing well. He drove across the city to Vantara Dynamics. He was dismissed before 9. To understand Nathan Reeves, you needed to understand what Paul Gentry had come to understand over the course of 8 months, which was the full length of the consulting arrangement Vantara had brought Nathan in to complete. Paul had not understood it all at once. He had understood it the way careful, observant people understand things they were not meant to notice, gradually, and then completely. He first noticed Nathan because of the way Nathan walked the production floor. Most consultants did not walk the production floor at all. They attended meetings, reviewed documentation, and wrote deliverables with the company name at the top. Nathan walked the floor every morning at 7, before most of the engineering staff arrived. He walked it slowly and without notes, stopping at intervals that were not regular but were not random. He had a way of crouching beside a component assembly and looking at it from below, from the angle the inspection camera could not reach, that Paul had only ever seen one other person do. That person was a man named Roy Stearns, who had retired 3 years earlier and who had built the original load testing protocol that the entire floor still ran on. Paul mentioned this to Nathan once. He said Nathan reminded him of Roy Stearns when he walked the floor. Nathan looked at him with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite recognition. He said he had known Roy a long time ago. He said Roy had taught him that the thing most likely to fail was always the thing nobody had thought to look at from the bottom. Paul did not press further. He was not a man who pressed. What he had assembled over 8 months in the patient way he assembled everything was this. Nathan Reeves was not reading the documentation. He was reading the structure itself. The way he moved through the floor, the questions he asked in technical reviews, the particular habit he had of measuring things by hand that the inspection records showed as nominal. None of it was the behavior of a contract engineer reviewing someone else's work. Then Mason arrived. It was the behavior of who understood the underlying design at the level of the person who had originally built it from the first specification. Nathan ran an auto body and frame repair shop off a side street in East Nashville. The shop was called Reeves & Co. It had 3 bays, a pair of frame-straightening benches, and a reputation in certain circles that was considerably larger than its signage. The men who brought their vehicles there for structural work did not find it through advertising. They found it the way people find things that do not need to advertise, through someone who knew. Nathan had opened it 4 years after leaving aerospace, 2 years after the accident that took his wife, and the work had been the one room in his life that did not feel like it was missing something. He drove to Vantara twice a week in a 12-year-old truck, and wore the gray shirt and the canvas bag, and walked the floor, and nobody on the engineering staff knew anything about the shop, or the truck, or the 4 years before the shop, because Nathan did not talk about those things, and because the people who might have connected the dots were no longer at Vantara in any capacity that would put them in the same room as a visiting consultant. Marcus Halliday knew. Marcus Halliday had hired him, or more precisely had approved the contracting arrangement that brought him in, knowing exactly what his background was, and calculating that the background was precisely what made him useful, and what made him manageable. A man with Nathan's history who was currently running a 3-bay repair shop in East Nashville was not in a position to make noise. He was in a position to be quietly engaged for 6 months, to provide the technical credibility that Marcus needed the load frame specification to have, and then be quietly disengaged before the certification process reached the stage where the modified geometry would need to be formally defended. That was the plan. It required Nathan not to notice the joint modification, or to notice it and choose to say nothing. He noticed it on his 2nd week. Paul had said nothing about any of this to anyone. He understood that there were things you saw at work that you were not paid to have an opinion about. He kept his head down and did his work carefully, the way he had always done his work. He did not say anything until the secondary load frame began to fail. That happened on the 4th day after Nathan's dismissal. It began, as structural failures in composite assemblies almost always begin, with a sound nobody could quite locate. The prototype was undergoing standard pre-qualification stress testing in Bay 3, a procedure the engineering team had run 17 times on previous assemblies. On the 18th run, at 82% of design load, one of the senior test engineers heard a frequency in the data stream that did not belong. It was not in any alarm threshold. It was not flagged by any automated system. It was the kind of signal a person learns to hear through years of close attention, the way a mechanic hears a knock that no instrument has registered yet. She stopped the test. She flagged the anomaly. She asked her team to run a full diagnostic before proceeding. The diagnostic returned clean on every documented parameter. They ran the test again. At 81% of design load, the sound returned. This time, 2 engineers heard it, and the frequency appeared as a faint, irregular mark on the vibration trace, visible only because Carla Huang, the test supervisor, had been reading the raw feed rather than the filtered output. Carla pulled the assembly offline and called the head of structural engineering at home. He drove in that evening and spent 3 hours working through the data. By the end of the evening, he had found nothing he could name. He called in 2 additional senior engineers. By the following morning, 5 people were working on an anomaly that every piece of their documentation told them did not exist. By end of day 2, there were 7 engineers working, and a consultant from the component manufacturer had been flown in from Cincinnati. The consultant from Cincinnati spent 4 careful hours with the assembly and went home without an answer. The team was not incompetent. That was not the problem. The problem was that the thing they needed to understand had never been entered into any version of the documentation that currently existed, and the only person who could have entered it had been escorted to the elevator 12 days ago. Sandra Okafor came to Bay 3 on the morning of the 3rd day. She stood at the observation window with Marcus Halliday beside her and watched the team work. The engineers were doing exactly what trained engineers do when facing an anomaly: systematic elimination, methodical documentation, steady professional composure. What they did not have, Sandra saw, was any visible sign of narrowing the distance between where they were and the answer. She asked Carla Huang what they knew. Carla said they knew the anomaly was structural, that it lived in the load transfer zone between the secondary frame and the longitudinal spine, and that it was not appearing in any model or specification in the system. She said they had ruled out the bonding surfaces, the end fittings, the primary spine geometry, thermal expansion, and resonance coupling. What remained, she said, was the interface zone itself, the precise geometry of where one structure handed its load to the next. She said they could not find it because whatever it was did not match anything the documentation described as being there. Sandra asked if this was critical. Carla said that at current stress loads, no. At certification level loads, she could not say with confidence. She said she needed more time, and she said she needed the right set of eyes on the interface zone. Sandra asked whose eyes. The pause before Carla answered was long enough to become its own kind of answer. Carla looked at the assembly through the observation glass. She said the right eyes had been in this building 12 days ago and were no longer there. A lamp on the far wall of Bay 3 blinked once and steadied. Sandra looked at Marcus Halliday. He was checking his phone with the focused attention of a man selecting among several prepared answers in real time. He said the situation was manageable. He said the team was fully capable. He said the project timeline could absorb a short delay. He said reintroducing an external party at this stage would create chain of command complications they did not need. He said he was confident in the team's ability to resolve it internally. Sandra said nothing. She looked at the assembly. Paul Gentry was standing at the far end of the observation corridor, just outside Sandra's peripheral vision. He had not been summoned. He had walked there because the thing he needed to understand was in that direction. He had been watching for about 8 minutes, thinking about 11 years of professional behavior and the particular arithmetic of a decision he was trying to make. The cost of saying something was a conversation he might regret. The cost of saying nothing was a different kind of cost entirely. That evening, he wrote Sandra Okafor a 4-sentence email. He said he had something relevant to share about the load frame anomaly. He said it would take 15 minutes. He said it was a structural matter, and he believed she would want to know. She replied in 22 minutes. She said first thing in the morning. He came at 7:30. She met him at the small round table by the window rather than at her desk. He told her what he had observed over 8 months. He described the morning floor walks, the conversation about Roy Stearns, the specific morning 3 weeks before the dismissal when Nathan had crouched at the load assembly and spent almost 4 minutes there before writing something in the notebook he carried in the front pocket of the canvas bag. Sandra was still while Paul talked. She asked no questions until he finished. She said, "Why are you telling me this now?" Paul said, "Because the assembly is in Bay 3 and nobody in that building can find what he found." She stood. He understood the meeting was over. He was back at his desk 20 minutes before his phone rang. She asked if he had a number for Nathan Reeves. He read it to her and hung up. What Paul did not know at that point, what Marcus Halliday had known entirely, and what Sandra had only begun to assemble, was the precise origin of the problem. The prototype had been built to a modified specification. The modification was minor on paper. A 17mm reduction in the overlap joint between the secondary frame brace and the longitudinal spine connector. It had been approved 6 months earlier, during a cost reduction review, through a document chain that bypassed the engineering review process. The subcontractor who proposed it operated under Marcus Halliday's budget authority. The document routing was Marcus's design. Nathan had found it on his second week at Vantara. He measured the joint geometry by hand during a morning floor walk, compared it to the archived design specification, and entered the discrepancy in his notebook. He mentioned it to Marcus Halliday in a brief, direct conversation outside the break room. The joint geometry needs to be reviewed before the assembly goes to stress testing. The modification has reduced the load transfer overlap below the design threshold, and the fatigue behavior at certification load is not predictable with current modeling. Marcus thanked him and said he would look into it. Within 48 hours, Marcus had begun building the case to Sandra for ending the consulting arrangement. He was precise and patient. He used the language of efficiency and organizational clarity, which was exactly the language Sandra had been hired to bring to Vantara after 2 failed contracts had strained the board's confidence in the previous leadership structure. He had been speaking that language for 4 years to protect decisions he could not afford to have reviewed. What he could not control was the assembly. What the assembly could not do was stop being what it was. Sandra called Nathan from her office. He answered on the second ring, his voice even and unhurried. She told him what had happened and what she needed. He said he would be there at noon. Then he said, "The joint modification in the overlap geometry. That is where it is. I wanted you to know before I came." She said, "I know." She sat with those 2 words for a moment, after she said them. She noticed that he did not ask how she had found out. She noticed what that said about him. He arrived at 11:53. He had a flat, hard-sided case and Iris beside him, because school had let out early and there had been no other option. Iris was in a yellow shirt with spool under her arm, walking at her father's side with the settled composure of a child who had spent time in adult workplaces and understood the relevant rules without being told them. Sandra came down to the lobby. She had not intended to. She had been at the window when the car pulled up, and she was in the elevator before she had finished deciding why. She arrived in the lobby and looked at Nathan and the flat case and the small girl beside him. She said, "Thank you for coming," he said. "This is Iris. She knows to stay in a waiting area." Sandra looked at Iris. Iris held spool slightly higher, and looked back at Sandra with the direct measuring attention she gave to things she had not yet formed a conclusion about. She said, "Are you the one who said Dad had to leave?" Sandra Okafor, who had delivered difficult news to difficult people in 3 cities without a visible flinch, was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes." Iris looked at her father. She looked back. She said, "Dad said you probably had a lot of people telling you things at the same time." Then she went back to examining the atrium above the lobby, which had an open ceiling she had decided was worth a careful look. Sandra looked at Nathan. Something moved across her face and was gone before it could settle into anything with a name. She said quietly, "Did you tell her that?" He said. She asked why. I gave her an honest answer. He walked past her toward the elevator. In Bay 3, he spent 11 minutes at the assembly before he spoke. He moved around it the way Paul Gentry had watched him move for 8 months, unhurried, stopping where the thing itself demanded stopping, crouching twice, resting his hand once on the spine connector for nearly 90 seconds, with his eyes somewhere else entirely, the way a person listens to a sound only they can hear. He opened the flat case and removed one contact measurement instrument. He placed it at 4 points along the overlap joint, read each number, and set the instrument back in the case. Carla Huang stood 3 feet from him. She had 14 years in aerospace structural work, and she watched him with the particular attention of someone watching a thing they have been trying to do and now understand they have been doing differently. He said, "The joint is running at 68% of design overlap. At certification load, the combined fatigue and resonance signature will produce a progressive delamination at the upper corner of the connector. It will not fail suddenly. It will open a gap of approximately 4 millimeters over 11 cycles, then propagate across the bonding surface." He paused. He said, "The modification reduced the load transfer path below the threshold at which the original design's safety factor applies. Whoever approved it did not model what happens to the fatigue curve at the new geometry." No one said anything. From somewhere deeper in the building, a piece of equipment moved through a calibration cycle. The sound reached the corridor and faded. He told them what the remediation required. He named the joint geometry that needed restoration, the interface plate specification, the revised test protocol, and the full documentation chain that would need to accompany the corrected assembly before it could proceed to certification. He said it would take 4 working days if the materials were already staged. Carla said they were. He said then it was a straightforward correction, and he would write the complete remediation specification before he left the building that day. Carla looked at the joint. She looked at him. She said, "You knew before the testing started." He said, "I flagged it." He said it without weight, the way you say something that belongs to the record and does not need decoration. They sat in the same conference room where 12 days earlier she had told him the engagement was concluded. The legal pad was gone. There was no red pen. Sandra had her hands folded on the table, and she looked at him without the professional distance she carried in rooms where she needed to be seen making decisions. She said she had made a judgment based on information that had been arranged for a specific outcome. She said that did not change what she had done to him or what it had cost. She said she had looked across a table at him and decided what he was before she asked him a single question worth asking. She said she had known better. She had spent enough years in this industry to know the difference between a man running from his credentials and a man who had simply stopped announcing them. She said she had looked away from that difference because looking had not been made convenient for her. She said that was not an excuse. She said, "I'm sorry. That is not on behalf of the company. That is from me." He let the silence sit for a moment. He said, "I accept that." He stated his condition before he agreed to complete the engagement. He wanted the joint modification removed from the approved change log, and the original design specification restored in the archive under the name of the engineer who authored it, which was not Marcus Halliday. He wanted the remediation specification filed under his own name, with a full notation of the modification history and the document chain through which it had been approved. He said those records needed to be accurate before anything else moved forward. Sandra said, "Done." She called Marcus Halliday into the conference room. He arrived composed. He sat with his jacket straight and his expression calibrated to reasonable concern. He lasted 3 sentences before Sandra set a document on the table in front of him. It was the original change order, located that morning in a filing route that did not pass through the CFO's approval chain. It had Marcus's initials and a routing date that was 71 hours after Nathan's conversation with him outside the break room. Marcus said, "This is a legal matter. I want counsel present before we continue." Nobody answered him. Security was at the hallway door. He looked at the door. He looked at Nathan, who was looking at the window. He said the company would not be standing without the decisions he had made. The doors closed. The remediation took 4 working days. Nathan arrived each morning at 7 and walked the floor before the team came in, the same way he had always walked it. He wrote the specification in sequential sections and reviewed each stage of the physical correction alongside Carla's team, answering questions with the direct specificity that made Paul Gentry feel, by comparison, that he had always been using more words than the situation required. On the 4th day, Nathan signed the completed specification and handed it to Carla. She thanked him without ceremony. He nodded and closed the flat case. Nathan's name was restored in the design archive on the 9th day of his return. A specification he had authored 3 years earlier, during a previous engagement that Marcus had absorbed into a project portfolio and listed under his own name, was correctly attributed. There was no announcement. The record simply became accurate again, the way a record becomes accurate when someone decides it should be. The board's review of Marcus Halliday's budget authority ran 3 weeks and revealed what reviews of that kind reveal when nobody has been carefully maintaining the borders. There was more. 7 similar change order approvals over 4 years, each routed through the same informal path, each bypassing engineering sign-off, each generating a margin that settled in accounts that were not Vantara's. The external audit ran 6 additional weeks. Marcus Halliday did not return to the building. Carla ran the first certification test on the corrected assembly herself. It passed at 107% of design load without anomaly. She wrote 1 line in the test log and went home. Paul Gentry finished the last of his contribution to the review file on a late Thursday evening, alone on the open engineering floor after the building had mostly emptied. He had been a structural analyst for 11 years. He had done his work carefully for all of those years and had not always said everything he saw. He did not think of the email to Sandra as courage because he did not think of himself as a courageous person. He thought of it the way Nathan might have thought of measuring a joint by hand when the inspection record showed it was nominal. You look at the thing from the bottom because that is where the answer is, and because the answer does not become less true because nobody asked for it. What the review had eventually revealed, and Paul had read the summary report, because Carla had sent it to the structural team as a matter of record, was that Marcus Halliday had been running the same kind of informal approval channel for 4 years. The joint modification was not the beginning of it and was not, it turned out, the most significant instance of it. There were 7 similar approvals, each avoiding the same engineering review process, each generating a budget margin that moved somewhere it had no business being. The external audit team spent 6 weeks tracing the document chains before they had a complete picture. What Paul thought about, reading that report, was the conversation he had never had. The conversation he could have had at a dozen different moments over 8 months. In the corridor in a review meeting, over a cup of coffee in the break room, in which he might have said to Nathan, directly, "I think I know who you were before you came here, and I think I know what that makes what you're seeing you don't say it. And I think someone in this building is hoping you don't say it." He had not said any version of that. He had watched and thought and said nothing, for 11 years of professional reasons that felt, in retrospect, less solid than he had believed them to be. The email to Sandra was 4 sentences. It had taken him most of an afternoon to write them. He turned off his desk light and walked to the elevator. In the lobby, he passed the atrium with its open ceiling, and he thought for a moment about a 6-year-old girl in a yellow shirt looking up at that ceiling, with spool tucked under her arm, her expression completely unconcerned with whatever was happening in the rooms above her. He thought about what she had said to Sandra Okafor. He thought about the fact that a child had said, in 4 words, the thing he had needed 11 years of careful professional experience to work up to saying in a 4-sentence email. He went out through the lobby doors into the Nashville evening, and the city ran its usual frequency around him, and he thought that some things only become visible from the bottom. and that the people who know how to look from there are not always the people in the front of the room. Sandra Okafor did not send Nathan a formal thank you letter. She came to the lobby on his last morning and thanked him in person, which was how she expressed things she meant. He said he was glad the frame was cleared. She said she was glad he came back. There was a pause that neither of them moved to fill. She said, "Your daughter." He looked at her. She said, "You told her I had a lot of people telling me things at once. You didn't have to do that." He said it was true. She nodded. He picked up the flat case. He walked toward the door. She said his name when he was almost through it. He turned. She said, "I looked at you and decided what you were. I knew better than that, and I did it anyway." She said it the way she had said it in the conference room, except that now they were standing in the light from the lobby doors and there was no table between them. And she said it like a person who has been thinking about a thing for 12 days and has finally arrived at the version of it that is true all the way through. "I'm going to try to do better than that," he said. "That's all any of it is." He walked out into the morning, and the door closed behind him. Nathan drove home that evening and parked in front of the house on the tree-lined street in East Nashville. The maple tree was fully into its summer leaves. He came through the front door at 5:40. Iris was at the kitchen table with her coloring books, spool propped against the sugar bowl in his regular position. She looked up. "You're early," she said. "The job is done," he said. He set the flat case by the door. He turned on the kitchen tap and started washing his hands. She watched him. "Did the lady say sorry?" Iris said. He turned off the water and reached for the dish towel. She did. Iris looked at Spool. She straightened one of the coloring books. She picked up her crayon. Was it a real sorry or a work sorry? He looked at her for a moment. "It was a real one," he said. She accepted this. She returned to the coloring book, her head bent, her small hand moving the crayon in slow and careful arcs along the edge of something that was becoming, under her patient attention, exactly what she intended it to be. The kitchen light was the long, level kind that comes only in the late afternoon, and it lay across the table and across Spool's worn gray body and across the top of Iris's bent head without hurry or announcement. The way light comes into a room that has been waiting for it all day and does not need to make a point of its arrival. This is a work of fiction. All names, characters, companies, institutions, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional and are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events or organizations is purely coincidental. This story was created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been underestimated. Every week, we tell the stories of the people the world walked past too quickly. They were worth stopping for.